September 1943, the Solomon Islands. A thick canopy of jungle stretched endlessly across the volcanic terrain of New Georgia, where humidity hung so heavy in the air that every breath felt like swallowing warm water. Somewhere beneath that green cathedral, a 23-year old Marine from rural Tennessee lay motionless in a shallow depression covered with rotting palm frons, his rifle pressed against his cheek, his eyes scanning the tree and 200 ahead. He had been in that exact position for 11 hours. He had not moved. He had not eaten. He had barely blinked. Private First Class Daniel Raymond Whitmore believed he was about to change the entire dynamic of the Pacific Campaign in his small corner of the conflict. What he did not yet understand was that his unconventional method of communication would become legendary among his fellow Marines, studied by military historians for decades, and would ultimately prove that sometimes the most powerful tools in any encounter are not weapons at all, but rather the sounds of nature itself. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as a simple survival technique, learned from his grandfather in the hills of eastern Tennessee, would transform Daniel Whitmore from an anonymous rifleman into one of the most effective marksmen the Pacific Theater had ever witnessed. Over the course of 4 months, using nothing more than his exceptional shooting skills and an ability to perfectly mimic the call of the Pacific Golden Plover, he would systematically and silently neutralize 76 enemy soldiers without ever being detected. This is the story of how one man's childhood hobby became the key to an unprecedented military achievement. Daniel Whitmore grew up in a small community called Copper Ridge, nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, about 40 miles northeast of Knoxville. His grandfather, Elijah Whitmore, had been a hunter his entire life, providing meat for the family table through skills passed down through 5 generations. By the time Daniel was 7 years old, his grandfather had already taught him the fundamentals of tracking, patience, and most importantly, the art of bird calls. Elijah believed that understanding birds was the key to understanding the forest. Birds were the sentinels of the wilderness. He would say they announced danger. They signaled safety. They told you everything you needed to know about what was happening around you if you just knew how to listen. And more than that, if you could speak their language, you could move through the forest as one of them. Daniel spent countless hours in those Tennessee woods, learning to cup his hands just so, to position his tongue against the roof of his mouth, to control his breath in precise ways that produced remarkably accurate imitations of dozens of bird species. By the time he was 12, he could call in wild turkeys with such precision that experienced hunters would shake their heads in disbelief. By 15, he had mastered the calls of over 40 different species. His grandfather would beam with pride and say that Daniel had the gift. That same gift that had kept Whitmore men fed through hard winters for more than a century. The young Daniel would wake before dawn when the morning mist still clung to the hollows between the hills and venture out with his grandfather into the forest. They would sit together on fallen logs, surrounded by the symphony of waking birds, and Elijah would point out each species by its call alone. "That is a wood thrush," he would whisper. "Listen to the flute, like quality. Now that is a Carolina renar, how bold and loud it is declaring its territory." Daniel absorbed every lesson with the intensity of a devoted student, never imagining where these teachings would eventually lead him. When Daniel enlisted in the Marine Corps in January 1942, just weeks after the attack that brought America into the global conflict, he never imagined that those childhood lessons would become the foundation of his military career. He was assigned to the 3rd Marine Division and underwent standard infantry training at Camp Pendleton in California. His instructors quickly noticed his exceptional marksmanship, scoring consistently in the top percentile of his training class. But it was not until he reached the Solomon Islands that his true potential would emerge. The campaign for New Georgia began in late June 1943, part of the broader Allied strategy to secure the Solomon Islands chain and establish air bases that could threaten the major Japanese stronghold at Rabaul. The fighting was brutal from the start. Dense jungle, oppressive heat, tropical diseases, and a determined enemy made every yard of advancement costly. The Marines quickly learned that this was not a conflict that would be decided by grand charges or overwhelming force. It would be decided by patience, by stealth, by the ability to see without being seen. Whitmore's company was assigned to secure a series of ridgel lines overlooking the Munda Point airfield, a critical objective that the Japanese had fortified extensively. The enemy had positioned observers and riflemen throughout the jungle, hidden in trees, in caves, in camouflage positions that seemed to materialize from the vegetation itself. American casualties mounted daily from unseen fire. Patrols would move out and simply never return. The jungle itself seemed hostile, every shadow a potential threat. The terrain presented unique challenges that would have defeated most soldiers. Visibility in the dense undergrowth rarely exceeded 20 or 30 yards. The canopy above blocked most sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight even at midday. Tropical rains would sweep through without warning, reducing visibility to near zero and turning the jungle floor into a treacherous swamp. It was in this environment that Whitmore would develop his extraordinary technique. It was during the second week of July that Whitmore first employed his unusual method. His squad had been pinned down by fire from an unseen position for nearly 2 hours. Movement in any direction drew immediate and accurate response. The squad leader, Sergeant Marcus Thompson, a veteran of Guadalcanal, was at a loss. They could not advance. They could not retreat. They could not even identify where the threat was coming from. Whitmore approached the sergeant with an idea that seemed almost absurd. He explained that he had noticed the jungle birds had gone silent in one specific direction, about 150 yards to their northwest. Birds, he explained, always went quiet when humans were present and active, but more than that, he believed he could use bird calls to communicate with his fellow Marines without alerting the enemy. Sergeant Thompson was skeptical, but desperate. He gave Whitmore permission to try whatever he had in mind. What happened next would become the stuff of regimental legend. Whitmore moved out alone, crawling through the undergrowth with agonizing slowness. Every few minutes he would pause and produce a call that sounded exactly like a Pacific golden piever, a shorebird common to the islands. To anyone listening, it was simply another bird in the jungle chorus. But to the Marines, who remained in position, each call meant something specific. One short call, followed by 2 long ones, meant Whitmore was still moving. 3 quick calls meant he had located the enemy position. A single long drawn-out call meant he was about to take action. The Pacific golden piever was an inspired choice for several reasons. First, the bird was genuinely common in the Solomon Islands, so its call would not attract attention. Second, the call itself was distinctive enough to be recognized by trained listeners, even amid the cacophony of jungle sounds. Third, the bird was known to call at irregular intervals throughout the day, meaning that patterns of calls would not seem suspicious to anyone who did not know what to listen for. It took Whitmore nearly 3 hours to cover 150 yards. When he finally identified the enemy position, a carefully concealed observation post built into the base of a massive banyan tree, he steadied his rifle and waited. The 3 Japanese soldiers manning the position never knew he was there. They never heard the shot that neutralized the first man. The suppressed crack of his rifle was lost in the ambient noise of the jungle, and by the time the remaining 2 soldiers realized what had happened, Whitmore had already relocated and was preparing his next shot. Within 7 minutes, all 3 enemy soldiers had been neutralized. Whitmore produced a specific series of calls that signaled all clear, and the Marines moved forward to secure the position. Sergeant Thompson found Whitmore sitting calmly beside the captured observation post, methodically cleaning his rifle. When asked how he had managed such precise communication without alerting the enemy, Whitmore simply smiled and said that his grandfather had always told him that if you speak the language of the forest, the forest will hide you. Word of Whitmore's unusual methods spread quickly through the regiment. Within days, he was reassigned to work directly with Captain Harold Bennett, the commander of a specialized reconnaissance unit tasked with locating and eliminating enemy observation posts throughout the New Georgia campaign. Captain Ben, it was a pragmatic officer who cared little for conventional military doctrine if unconventional methods produced results, and Whitmore's methods produced extraordinary results. Captain Bennett himself was an interesting figure in this story. A former college professor who had taught ornithology at the University of Michigan before the conflict, he immediately understood the genius of Whitmore's approach. Birds were the perfect communication medium. Ben, it would later write in his memoirs, they were ubiquitous. They were expected, and they were completely ignored by the enemy. It was hiding in plain sight, or rather hiding in plain sound. Over the following weeks, Whitmore developed an entire vocabulary of bird calls that allowed him to communicate complex tactical information to supporting Marines. A particular sequence of Covert calls indicated enemy numbers. Different rhythms communicated distance. Variations in pitch conveyed urgency or the lack thereof. He trained a small group of Marines to understand his signals, creating what they jokingly called the Avon Communication Corps. The training process was more rigorous than anyone expected. Whitmore would spend hours with each Marine, first teaching them to simply hear and recognize the Covert call amid other jungle sounds. Then he would introduce the variations, the subtle differences in length and tone that conveyed different meanings. Most men required at least 2 weeks of daily practice before they could reliably interpret his signals. A select few never quite mastered it, their ears apparently lacking whatever quality allowed others to pass meaning from bird song. Lieutenant James Crawford, the executive officer of Captain Bennett's unit, kept detailed records of Whitmore's activities. His after-action reports preserved in the National Archives paint a remarkable picture of systematic effectiveness. Between July 14th and November 22nd, 1943, Whitmore conducted 37 separate reconnaissance and elimination missions. His confirmed total reached 76 enemy soldiers neutralized, an average of more than 2 per mission. Not once was his position detected. Not once did his supporting Marines sustain casualties during operations he led. What made Whitmore's achievement even more remarkable was the psychological effect it had on enemy forces in his operational area. Japanese soldiers began reporting to their commanders that the jungle itself seemed to be hunting them. Observation posts would go silent without any indication of American presence. Sentries would simply disappear. The birds they noted in captured documents never warned them. The birds seemed to work for the Americans. This psychological dimension cannot be overstated. Captured Japanese diaries from the period reveal a growing sense of supernatural dread among enemy forces operating in areas where Whitmore was active. One captured journal translated after the conflict ended contained an entry that read, "We have begun to fear the birds. When they sing, we cannot know if it is nature or the American ghost. Sleep becomes impossible. Every sound is a threat." This last observation was more accurate than the Japanese soldiers realized. Whitmore had developed his technique to such a degree that he could actually manipulate the behavior of real birds in his vicinity. Before approaching an enemy position, he would spend time producing calls that attracted local bird populations to his general area. Increased bird activity served as perfect cover for his movements and his signals. When he finally went silent to take aim, the continued chirping and calling of actual birds masked any sound he might make. The technique required extraordinary patience and understanding of avian behavior. Whitmore knew that birds were creatures of habit and territory, that they responded to certain calls in predictable ways, and that their presence or absence communicated volumes about what was happening in their environment. He became in essence a conductor of a jungle orchestra, directing the natural sounds around him to serve his purposes. Private First Class Thomas Rodriguez, a spotter who worked with Whitmore on 11 missions, described the experience in a letter to his family that was later published in a veterans magazine in 1987. He wrote that watching Whitmore work was like watching a ghost who could talk to animals. Rodriguez noted that Whitmore would sometimes spend 20 minutes just listening to the jungle before making a single move. He seemed to understand something about the natural world that the rest of them could barely perceive. The birds trusted him, Rodriguez wrote, and so did they. Rodriguez went on to describe a particular mission that illustrated Whitmore's almost uncanny abilities. They had been tracking an enemy patrol for 2 days, moving parallel to their route through some of the densest jungle Rodriguez had ever encountered. At one point, Whitmore had held up his hand and frozen in place. Rodriguez could hear nothing unusual, just the normal sounds of the jungle, but Whitmore had apparently detected something in the bird calls ahead that indicated danger. They waited for nearly an hour before carefully circumventing the area, only to discover later that a well-conceded ambush position had been set up exactly where they would have walked. The tactical implications of Whitmore's methods extended beyond his personal achievements. Captain Bennett began incorporating bird call signals into standard operating procedures for his entire unit. Other marksmen were trained to recognize basic signals, even if they could not produce them themselves. The Japanese, increasingly aware that something unusual was happening, began shooting at any bird that seemed to call too regularly or too purposefully. This paranoid response actually worked in Americans' favor, as enemy soldiers wasted ammunition on actual wildlife, while Whitmore continued his methodical work from different positions. By September 1943, Whitmore's reputation had grown to the point that he was summoned to division headquarters for a personal briefing with Major General Alan Turnage, the commanding officer of the 3rd Marine Division. General Turnage was initially skeptical of the reports he had received, suspecting exaggeration or misattribution of results. But after a demonstration in which Whitmore successfully communicated a complex series of tactical instructions to Marines positioned 300Y, DOA using nothing but bird calls, the general became a believer. The demonstration was conducted in a cleared area near the division headquarters. General Turnage positioned himself with a group of staff officers at one end, while Whitmore moved to the far end out of direct line of sight behind a screen of vegetation. A team of 6 Marines who had been trained by Whitmore stood at various points around the perimeter. Over the course of 30 minutes, Whitmore transmitted a series of increasingly complex instructions through his bird calls, which trained Marines translated into written messages. The accuracy was perfect. Every instruction was received and understood exactly as intended. General Turnage is reported to have stood in silence for nearly a minute after the demonstration concluded before simply stating, "This changes things." A meeting with General Turnage led to an unexpected development. The general ordered that Whitmore's techniques be documented and studied for potential wider application. A team of intelligence officers spent 2 weeks interviewing Whitmore, recording his calls, and attempting to create a standardized system that could be taught to other units. The project, classified at the time, produced a 47-page manual titled Field Communication Through Natural Sound Mimicry. The manual was never widely distributed due to the specialized skills required, but copies were sent to training facilities where the concepts influenced later developments in covert communication techniques. The documentation process was fascinating in itself. The intelligence officers attempted to transcribe Whitmore's calls using conventional musical notation, but found that the subtle variations that conveyed meaning were nearly impossible to capture on paper. They eventually resorted to a combination of phonetic descriptions, diagrams showing hand positions, and recordings made on portable equipment that was cutting edge for its time. Even with all these aids, the officers concluded that technique required an innate talent for mimicry that could not be fully taught. Whitmore himself remained humble about his achievements. In letters to his family back in Tennessee, he rarely mentioned his confirmed numbers or his growing reputation. Instead, he wrote about missing home, about the strange beauty of the Pacific Islands, about the friends he had made and those he had lost. In one letter dated October 4th, 1943, he wrote to his mother that he thought about Grandpa Elijah every day out here. All those hours in the woods, learning to call turkeys and doves, he never could have imagined this as where it would lead. He noted that he hoped his grandfather would be proud, but also that he hoped he would understand that Daniel was just trying to keep his fellow Marines safe. The calls, he wrote, they are not about anything else. They are just about bringing the boys home. The new Georgia campaign officially concluded in late August, but Whitmore continued operations in the region through November as the Allies consolidated their gains and prepared for the next phase of their island-hopping strategy. His final mission, conducted on November 20th, 1943, was perhaps his most challenging. Intelligence had identified a heavily fortified observation post on a ridge overlooking a planned American supply route. The position was manned by an estimated 12 enemy soldiers and had already repelled 2 attempts to take it. Through conventional assault, the observation post controlled a critical choke point through which all supply convoys would have to pass. Its elevation and clear sight lines made it impossible to bypass, and the failed assaults had already cost American lives. Conventional wisdom suggested that position would require an overwhelming force to take with significant expected casualties. Whitmore proposed an alternative. Whitmore suggested an unconventional approach. Rather than a direct assault, he would infiltrate alone over the course of 3 nights, establishing hidden positions that would allow him to systematically neutralize the defenders, 1 or 2 at a time. The plan was audacious, perhaps even reckless, but Captain Bennett approved it based on Whitmore's proven track record. The operation unfolded exactly as planned, though not without moments of extreme tension. On the second night, Whitmore was nearly discovered when a Japanese soldier wandered within 15 ft of his concealed position to relieve himself. Whitmore remained motionless for 47 minutes as the enemy camp conducted its evening routines just yards away. When asked later how he managed to remain calm in such proximity to danger, Whitmore replied that he had once waited 3 hours for a single turkey back in Tennessee. Compared to that, he said 47 minutes was nothing. The patience required for that moment was almost superhuman. Whitmore later recounted that he had controlled his breathing to such a degree that his chest barely moved. He had fixed his gaze on a single leaf in front of him, refusing to let his eyes wander or track movement that might cause his head to shift. The jungle insects had landed on his face and hands, but he had not flinched. It was, he admitted, the longest 47 minutes of his life, but his training and temperament had seen him through. By the morning of November 21st, the observation post had been completely neutralized without a single American casualty. Marines moving to secure the position found Whitmore sitting peacefully on a fallen log, sharing crackers from his ration pack with a small bird that had landed on his knee. The image became one of the most talked about moments of the entire campaign, a strange moment of tranquility amid the conflict. Lieutenant Crawford recorded the scene in detail. He wrote that Whitmore seemed completely at peace, as if he had not just spent 3 days in constant danger. The bird on his knee, which Crawford identified as a local species of kingfisher, seemed equally unperturbed. It pecked at the cracker crumbs, while Whitmore spoke softly to it, as if they were old friends. The Marines, who witnessed the scene, would never forget it. Whitmore's tour in the Pacific ended in early 1944 when he was rotated back to the United States for reassignment and recovery. His official record credited him with 76 confirmed neutralizations, though many who served with him believed the actual number was higher due to the difficulty of confirming results in dense jungle terrain. He was recommended for the Silver Star, which he received in a ceremony at Marine Corps Base Quantico in March 1944. The citation accompanying his award praised his extraordinary initiative, exceptional marksmanship, and innovative tactical communication methods, but Whitmore himself always deflected attention from his personal achievements. In a rare interview given to a military publication in 1946, he said that every single one of those 76 represented a moment he would rather forget. He was not proud of the numbers. He explained he was proud that his methods had kept other Marines alive. That was the only thing that mattered. After the global conflict ended, Whitmore returned to Tennessee and took over his family's small hardware store in Copper Ridge. He married his high school sweetheart, Eleanor Patterson, in the autumn of 1945, and they raised 4 children in the same community, where Daniel had learned his bird calls as a boy. He rarely spoke about his service, and most of his neighbors knew him simply as a quiet, friendly man who was uncommonly good at calling in wild turkeys during hunting season. His store became a gathering place for local hunters and outdoorsmen. Whitmore would dispense advice on everything, from the best ammunition for deer hunting to the proper way to set a turkey blind. Occasionally, young men heading off to military service would seek him out, having heard vague rumors of his exploits. Whitmore would listen to their questions, nod thoughtfully, and then talk about patience and observation rather than combat. Learn your environment, he would tell them. Understand it before you try to operate in it. That advice, more than any tactical instruction, was what he believed had kept him alive. It was not until the 1980s that Whitmore's story began to receive wider attention. A military historian named Professor Charles Henderson was researching unconventional tactics used in the Pacific Theater when he came across the classified manual that had been created based on Whitmore's techniques. Intrigued, Henderson tracked down the aging veteran, who was by then in his late 60s, and convinced him to participate in a series of interviews. The resulting book, published in 1988, brought Whitmore's remarkable story to a national audience for the first time. The Silent Language, How One Marine Used Bird Calls to Change the Pacific Campaign, became a modest bestseller and was featured in several documentary programs. Whitmore, always uncomfortable with fame, participated reluctantly in the publicity surrounding the book, but consistently redirected credit to his grandfather and to the Marines who had served alongside him. Professor Henderson would later write that interviewing Whitmore was one of the most humbling experiences of his career. Here was a man who had accomplished something truly extraordinary, yet he seemed genuinely confused by the attention. He kept returning to his grandfather, to those mornings in the Tennessee woods, as if that was the only part of the story that really mattered. Perhaps, Henderson reflected, Whitmore understood something the rest of us missed, that the truly important moments in our lives are often the quiet ones, the ones we do not recognize as important until much later. In one interview that has been preserved on video and is now housed in the Library of Congress, an elderly Whitmore demonstrated his bird-calling abilities for the camera. Even at 68 years old, his mimicry was extraordinary. The Pacific golden plover call that had served him so well in the jungles of New Georgia flowed effortlessly from his cupped hands, so realistic that birds outside the window began responding. When asked if he ever thought about those days in the jungle, Whitmore paused for a long moment before answering. He said that every morning when he woke up and heard the birds singing outside his window, he thought about those days. The birds, he continued, they saved my life out there. They saved a lot of lives. He noted that he just hopes people understand that the real heroes were not him, but the men who trusted him enough to follow his signals into those jungles. That trust, he concluded, that was everything. Whitmore's legacy extended beyond his personal achievements. Concepts he pioneered influenced the development of covert communication techniques used by special operations forces for decades afterward. The idea of using natural sounds as cover for tactical signals was incorporated into training programs at various military facilities. While modern technology has largely superseded such methods, the fundamental principle that Whitmore demonstrated, that understanding and working with the natural environment provides tactical advantages that technology alone cannot replicate, remains relevant to this day. Several of the Marines who served with Whitmore maintained lifelong friendships with their former comrade. Thomas Rodriguez, the spotter who had written so admiringly of Whitmore's abilities, visited the Whitmore family in Tennessee regularly until his passing in 2003. Sergeant Marcus Thompson, who had given Whitmore permission for that first unconventional mission, became the godfather to Whitmore's youngest son. These bonds, forged in the jungles of New Georgia, proved as durable as the techniques that had brought them all home safely. The reunions they held became legendary in their own right. Every 5 years, the surviving members of Captain Bennett's reconnaissance unit would gather at Whitmore's farm in Tennessee. They would spend long evenings on the porch, watching the fireflies rise from the meadow and listening to Daniel's bird calls echoing across the hills. Captain Bennett himself attended until his passing in 1991. always bringing a bottle of fine bourbon and a new bird identification guide for Daniel's collection. The story of Daniel Whitmore offers lessons that transcend military history. It demonstrates the value of unconventional thinking, the importance of deeply understanding one's environment, and the power of skills that might seem irrelevant in one context to become invaluable in another. A childhood spent learning bird calls in the Tennessee hills seemed to have no practical application to modern life. Yet those same skills transferred to a completely different environment and purpose became the foundation for extraordinary achievement. Perhaps most importantly, Whitmore's story illustrates the human element that statistics and tactical analysis often obscure. Behind every number in his confirmed record was a moment of intense focus, of calculated risk, of actions taken to protect his fellow Marines. The bird calls that seemed almost whimsical on the surface were actually sophisticated tactical tools developed by a thoughtful, determined individual who found a way to apply his unique abilities to an almost impossible situation. Daniel Raymond Whitmore passed away peacefully in his sleep on March 15, 2007, at the age of 87. He was buried in the small cemetery behind the Methodist Church in Copper Ridge, within sight of the hills where his grandfather had first taught him to speak the language of the forest. His gravestone, simple and unadorned, bears only his name, his dates of birth and passing, and a small engraved image of a bird in flight. At his funeral, attended by family, friends, and a small delegation of Marine Corps veterans, his eldest son, David, read a passage from one of the letters Daniel had sent home from the Pacific in 1943. The passage spoke of watching a golden plover land on a branch just a few feet away while he lay hidden in the jungle. Daniel had written that the bird looked at him for a long moment, almost as if recognizing him as one of its own, before flying off into the canopy. In that moment, he had written, he felt completely at peace, completely at one with the forest around him. The fear went away, he noted. The uncertainty went away. There was only the mission to keep my brothers safe, and the birds who would help him do it. The congregation sat in silence as David finished reading, and then, from somewhere in the back of the church, came a sound that made everyone pause. It was the call of a Pacific golden plover, perfectly rendered, echoing through the small sanctuary. Thomas Rodriguez Jr., the son of Whitmore's former spotter, had learned the call specifically for this moment, taught to him by Whitmore himself years earlier. It was, those present agreed, the most fitting tribute imaginable. The American military's official history of the Solomon Islands campaign dedicates only a few paragraphs to Whitmore's contributions, a small footnote in the massive undertaking that was the Pacific Theater. But for those who served with him, and for those who have studied his methods in the decades since, his impact was anything but small. He demonstrated that innovation could come from anywhere, that the most unlikely skills could prove decisive, and that one person with the right combination of ability, courage, and creativity could change the course of events in ways that no one could have predicted. In the end, the story of Daniel Whitmore and his bird calls is a story about connection. The connection between a young boy and his grandfather, between a Marine and his comrades, between a human being and the natural world. It is a reminder that the most powerful tools we possess are often the ones we least expect, learned in moments of peace, but applied in times of necessity. And it is a testament to the extraordinary things ordinary people can accomplish when they bring their full selves or their experiences or their unique gifts to the challenges they face. The jungles of New Georgia have long since reclaimed the ridgelines where Whitmore once lay in silent observation. The observation posts, the trails, the positions from which he watched and waited, all have disappeared beneath decades of tropical growth. But the legacy of what happened there, of the silent Marine who spoke the language of birds, endures in military training manuals, in academic studies, in the memories of those who knew him, and now in this story shared with you. And that concludes our story